What if the man you humiliated turned out to be the most powerful person on the plane? Finn Graves stepped onto the luxury aircraft, his presence barely acknowledged by the flight attendants who were too busy catering to the wealthy elite. He looked out of place, a frail black man, thin to the point of appearing sickly, dressed in clothes that lacked the effortless affluence of his fellow passengers. His eyes, sunken from exhaustion, carried a quiet patience that most mistook for weakness. They saw him, but they didn't respect him. Tatiana Rhodes, the head flight attendant, certainly didn't. To her, he was an anomaly, a mistake in a cabin designed for the world's most powerful. She didn't ask how he got there. She didn't care. She only saw what she wanted to see, a man who didn't belong. What followed was a carefully constructed humiliation, subtle at first, then ruthless. A seat adjustment here, a whispered insult there, a public spectacle disguised as airline policy. Finn was ridiculed, isolated, and pushed to the very edge. The passengers, emboldened by Tatiana's cruelty, laughed along. But what none of them realized was that the man they were mocking wasn't just a passenger. Finn Graves wasn't just anyone. He was the one person on this plane they should have feared the most. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. If you love stories with epic twists and justice served cold, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. What would you have done if you were in Finn's place? And where are you watching from? Let me know below. Finn stepped onto the aircraft, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing against his bones. The lighting in the first-class cabin was warm and golden, designed to exude exclusivity. Everything from the velvet seats to the chilled champagne being poured into crystal flutes whispered wealth. He clutched the handle of his modest leather bag, a relic from better days, and inhaled deeply before making his way toward his seat. That was when she blocked his path. Tatiana Rhodes, the head flight attendant, stood in front of him with a practiced, polite smile. But her eyes betrayed her thoughts. There was a flash of disbelief, then a flicker of mild disgust, as if something about him did not belong. She looked him up and down, taking in the loose sleeves of his blazer hanging over his gaunt wrists, the sunken hollows beneath his cheekbones. Then, with an exaggerated movement, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a disposable face mask. "Would you like one, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with a saccharine concern that was anything but genuine. "I wouldn't want my passengers inhaling anything unexpected." The words hit like a slap. A quiet hush spread among the passengers in the nearby seats. Someone let out a stifled chuckle. Finn knew better than to react, better than to give them what they wanted. A scene, an outburst, anything that would justify their assumptions about him. He forced a weak smile. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you." Tatiana held her smile but didn't move. Her grip on the mask lingered, as if she was waiting for him to change his mind. When it became clear he wouldn't, she let out a small sigh, shook her head, and tucked it back into her pocket, as if she had tried her best to be charitable. Then she finally stepped aside, but not before turning to one of her fellow attendants and muttering something under her breath. Finn caught a single word: mistake. As he continued down the aisle, he noticed the way some of the passengers stole glances at him before looking away. Some whispered behind manicured fingers. Some smirked into their glasses of champagne. He kept walking. When he finally reached his assigned seat, he began to place his bag into the overhead compartment. But before he could settle in, he felt movement. His seat was shifting. No, being moved. Finn turned his head just in time to see another attendant, under Tatiana's direction, discreetly adjusting the seat's placement. The action was almost imperceptible, but Finn noticed it immediately. His chair was being pushed back, separated from the others by a few inches. "Excuse me," he said, his voice measured, careful. "What are you doing?" Tatiana turned, all wide eyes and feigned innocence. "Oh, nothing at all, sir," she said smoothly. "It's just a minor adjustment, making sure everything is in order." Finn's jaw clenched. It was subtle, just enough to make him feel singled out, without allowing him the luxury of an outright complaint. He exhaled slowly and took his seat, feeling the extra space between himself and the other passengers like a chasm. He placed his hands in his lap, fingers tightening around his own skin. He had dealt with people like Tatiana before, people who wrapped their cruelty in civility, who inflicted humiliation with a practiced hand, so masterfully that those around them would only see professionalism. He could already predict the way this flight was going to unfold. A waiter-like attendant moved past him with a tray of warm towels, offering them to the other passengers in preparation for takeoff. When he reached Finn's row, he hesitated, then smoothly skipped over him as if he weren't there. Tatiana, from a few feet away, smiled to herself. Finn exhaled slowly, pressing his palm against his knee. Just endure it, he told himself. Just get through the flight. As the aircraft doors sealed shut and the pilot's voice came through the speakers welcoming everyone aboard, Finn felt the plane lurch forward. A new weight settled in his chest, not from the altitude, not from the illness gnawing at his body, but from something heavier, something far worse. Finn sat still, forcing himself to breathe evenly as the plane taxied down the runway. The murmur of first-class passengers barely registered over the low hum of the engines, but he felt their presence like a weight pressing against his skin. Every movement, every breath was under scrutiny. He could feel it. Tatiana, standing a few rows ahead, whispered something to another flight attendant, then nodded in his direction. A moment later, the attendant approached his seat, a roll of bright red tape in hand, and without hesitation, peeled off a long strip before pressing it firmly onto the headrest above Finn's seat. The words printed in bold white letters made Finn's stomach tighten. Passenger requires special assistance. The phrase was neutral, almost clinical, but the meaning behind it burned through him like acid. The subtlety of it was brilliant, an official-looking label that carried just enough ambiguity to let passengers assume the worst. Was he contagious? Mentally unstable? On the verge of collapsing? Tatiana had executed it perfectly, ensuring that he would be viewed with either pity or quiet alarm for the remainder of the flight. A woman in the next row leaned toward her husband, speaking in hushed tones. The man glanced at Finn, his gaze briefly flicking to the red label, before he exhaled through his nose and shifted in his seat, angling his body away as if proximity alone could make him vulnerable to whatever special assistance Finn supposedly required. Tatiana strolled back toward him, stopping just long enough to tilt her head, feigning concern. "I hope this makes things easier for you," she said smoothly, her lips curving in satisfaction. "We want to make sure you're as comfortable as possible during the flight." Finn said nothing. He simply held her gaze, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Then the lights flickered. It happened so quickly that at first, Finn thought it was just turbulence interfering with the electrical system. But when the overhead light stabilized, he realized something was off. Every seat remained bathed in a warm golden glow, except his. The space around him had been plunged into an unnatural dimness, as if a shadow had fallen exclusively over his row. Finn blinked, glancing up at the light fixture above him. Dead. Tatiana made a soft sound of surprise, then clicked her tongue. "Oh, dear," she murmured. "That's strange. It seems like we have a little malfunction here." A few passengers turned their heads to watch. Finn clenched his fists, already knowing what was happening, but powerless to stop it. Tatiana crouched slightly, pressing a few buttons on the panel above his seat, her fingers moving in a slow, deliberate manner that suggested she was in no hurry to fix anything. She sighed dramatically. "Sometimes technology just refuses to cooperate," she said, standing upright. "But don't worry, Mr. Graves. Maybe it's just a reflection of the energy around us." Someone snickered. A younger man 2 rows ahead twisted in his seat, smirking. "Maybe the plane knows something we don't," he joked, nudging the woman beside him. Tatiana smiled, though she quickly masked it with a look of professional sympathy. "Well," she continued, "at least it won't be too distracting. You weren't planning to read, were you?" Finn exhaled slowly through his nose. His fingers curled around the armrests, knuckles widening. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to demand they turn the light back on. That was what she wanted. A scene. Proof that he was a disruption. Passengers resumed their conversations, but Finn knew the damage had been done. He was officially other, marked, isolated, and now, Thanks to the dim lighting and the red label above his seat, he wasn't just the sickly-looking man who didn't belong in first class. He was the problem. Tatiana didn't move right away. She stood there for a moment longer, watching him, gauging whether or not he would break. When he didn't, she gave a small nod, her smile tightening at the corners. "Let me know if you need anything," she said sweetly before walking away, leaving Finn sitting in the cold, dark silence of his seat. The red label above his seat still loomed over him like a scarlet mark of exclusion, and Tatiana, though physically distant, remained an unshakable presence. Every movement, every breath felt choreographed, a performance designed to break him piece by piece. He refused to react, but he knew she wasn't done. Minutes passed, and Finn slowly reached for the reading light above his seat, clicking it on in an attempt to restore some normalcy. The bulb flickered for half a second before bursting to full intensity, a sharp, unnatural brightness flooding his immediate space. He flinched as the harsh white light burned into his retinas, searing through the dark like a camera flash held too close. His head jerked to the side, eyes squeezed shut against the sudden assault. Across the aisle, someone snickered under their breath. Tatiana materialized at his side almost immediately, her expression a careful mask of concern. "Oh, dear," she cooed, tilting her head. "That's strange. It looks like your light is stuck on maximum brightness. I hope that's not too much for you." She leaned in as if inspecting the panel, fingers dancing just out of reach of the controls. "You know, some people are more sensitive to light than others. Maybe you should close your eyes for a while. Rest." The words were delivered with all the politeness of a helpful suggestion, but Finn knew better. She wasn't offering him comfort. She was making it clear that this was another carefully engineered inconvenience, another test to see how far she could push him. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, though the blinding light bore into him like a physical weight. His fingers flexed against the armrest as he fought the instinct to switch the light off, knowing it would only amuse her more if he acknowledged the discomfort. Instead, he remained still, staring blankly ahead even as his vision blurred from the sheer intensity. He could hear Tatiana's breath hitch slightly, almost as if she were disappointed by his lack of reaction. She clicked her tongue, then reached up and flicked the light off herself, but not before adding a final remark. "They're all better, but let me know if you need help. I imagine it's hard to navigate things when your body is not at its best." Finn inhaled slowly through his nose, exhaling just as quietly. He didn't move, didn't speak, just allowed her words to hang in the air between them. Tatiana lingered for a moment longer, but when he refused to take the bait, she straightened, brushing non-existent dust from her perfectly pressed uniform before moving away. The moment she disappeared, Finn allowed his shoulders to drop slightly. He blinked a few times, trying to clear the lingering afterimages burned into his vision. He had survived this round, but he knew there was more to come. Tatiana had expected him to react, to falter, to lash out in frustration. When he hadn't, she had been forced to switch tactics. His prediction proved right when, not 5 minutes later, his seat jolted suddenly. Finn's body tensed as he felt the backrest shift, pressing into his spine until he was seated at an almost perfect 90-degree angle. The rigid position sent an uncomfortable strain through his lower back, but before he could adjust, the chair lurched again, reclining abruptly until he was nearly lying flat. His pulse quickened. The movement was too precise, too calculated to be an accident. Tatiana reappeared, this time holding a tablet in one hand. "Oh, that's odd," she mused, tapping on the screen with an exaggerated frown. "It seems like your seat is experiencing some technical difficulties. I can try to reset it, but these older models can be unpredictable." Finn braced himself as the chair shifted again, this time jerking forward so suddenly that it nearly forced him into a hunched position. His stomach tightened as the edges of his vision darkened for a brief moment, the movement triggering a wave of nausea that he barely suppressed. He took a steadying breath, gripping the armrest to ground himself. The sensation of being completely at someone else's mercy was suffocating. Tatiana pretended to press a few more buttons, then sighed. "Well, it looks like this will take some time to fix," she said, slipping the tablet under her arm. "I hope that won't be too much of an inconvenience." A man 2 seats over smirked, whispering something to his companion. Finn didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. He could feel the weight of their amusement, the way they reveled in his discomfort. Tatiana stepped back, a triumphant gleam in her eyes as she finally turned away. The seat remained stuck in an awkward, uncomfortable position, leaving Finn trapped between too much and too little space. He exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temple. She was escalating, seeing just how much he could take before he snapped. The muscles along his back ached, but the physical discomfort was secondary to the unspoken message being broadcasted throughout first class. He didn't belong here. The small, petty humiliations had begun to stack, forming a slow, grinding weight that pressed against his patience. But he refused to break. He wouldn't give them that. Tatiana, standing by the beverage cart with an air of exaggerated nonchalance, suddenly clapped her hands together, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her tone dripping with the artificial enthusiasm of a game show host, "since this is such an exclusive flight, I thought it would be fun to lighten the mood with a little in-flight entertainment." Passengers perked up, some glancing her way with mild curiosity. A few already had knowing smiles on their lips, as if they understood that whatever was about to happen had very little to do with entertainment and everything to do with furthering Tatiana's personal amusement. Finn remained silent, waiting. Tatiana gestured toward one of her fellow flight attendants, who immediately stepped forward with a sleek black tablet in hand. "We're conducting a little poll," she continued, tapping dramatically at the screen. "Just a fun, harmless question for our lovely first-class guests. Who, in your opinion, has the most unforgettable fashion sense today?" Finn barely had time to process the words before he felt it. The shift in the air, the way bodies turned ever so slightly toward him, the poorly concealed smirks beginning to form across champagne-kissed lips. The game had been set, and he was the only piece on the board. Tatiana made a show of pretending to scan the cabin as if there were multiple possible candidates, but her gaze landed on him with surgical precision, her smile widening just enough to confirm what they all already knew. "Remember, this is all in good fun," she purred, her fingers hovering over the tablet. "So be honest." A businessman 2 rows ahead let out a quiet chuckle before leaning toward his companion. A woman near the window covered her lips with delicate fingers, whispering something to the man beside her, who nodded in agreement. The poll was nothing more than a formality, a scripted scene where the outcome had been decided before it even began. Tatiana tapped a few buttons, then let out a faux gasp. "Oh my," she said, tilting the screen toward a fellow attendant as if she couldn't believe the results. "It looks like we have a winner." A few passengers laughed outright, their gazes flicking to Finn, waiting for his reaction. Finn felt his nails digging into the armrest, the slow burn of frustration curling in his chest. He forced his face to remain impassive. He had known this was coming, known Tatiana would escalate beyond the small, calculated inconveniences. She wanted something more public, something undeniable. He had expected cruelty, but the sheer audacity of her performance still sent a sharp pulse of anger through him. Tatiana, ever the gracious host, let the laughter die down before placing a manicured hand over her heart. "Of course, there's no actual prize," she mused, tapping her chin. "But as a gesture of goodwill, I do have something special for our honored guest." She turned, retrieving a neatly folded blanket from the beverage cart. The moment she unfurled it, Finn felt the weight of a fresh humiliation settle over him. The fabric was a garish shade of bright, almost fluorescent orange, a color that clashed horribly with the refined aesthetic of first class. He recognized the design immediately, not a standard airline blanket, but one specifically used in emergency kits, meant for patients in medical distress or more commonly for individuals in detainment. A prisoner's blanket. Tatiana held it out toward him, her expression unreadable save for the slight upturn of her lips. "We wouldn't want you to get cold," she said smoothly, shaking the blanket just enough to make the fabric rustle. "But I thought something a bit more distinctive would suit you better. The usual blankets don't quite match the situation, do they?" The implication hung between them, thick and suffocating. Finn didn't move, didn't react. He let the silence stretch, let Tatiana bask in her little victory, let the other passengers shift in their seats, caught between amusement and the kind of second-hand discomfort that only came from witnessing something truly vicious disguised as hospitality. He saw it then, the flicker of impatience in Tatiana's eyes, the brief moment where she realized she had miscalculated. He wasn't reacting the way she wanted. No protest, no visible anger, no attempt to shrink into himself. Just a blank, unreadable stare. A few seconds passed, then Finn reached forward, took the blanket without a word, and draped it carefully over his lap. The simple act stole some of Tatiana's satisfaction, but she recovered quickly, letting out an airy laugh before stepping back. "Wonderful," she said, spinning on her heel. "Now that we've had our fun, let's all sit back and enjoy the flight, shall we?" She strode away, her victory secured in the whispers and lingering amusement around the cabin. Finn adjusted the blanket slightly, his fingers brushing over the rough fabric. He recognized the tactic: humiliation disguised as generosity, exclusion wrapped in the illusion of inclusion. Finn adjusted the rough orange blanket over his lap, his fingers brushing against the synthetic fabric as he felt the weight of every stare pressing against him. The laughter had faded, replaced by that lingering, oppressive awareness that he had been marked, not just as an outcast, but as the designated spectacle of this flight. Tatiana moved gracefully through the aisle, pouring champagne into waiting glasses, her posture radiating satisfaction. She had won yet another round, but Finn could see it in the way she glanced back at him every so often. She wanted more. The speakers above crackled to life, cutting through the murmurs of conversation. Tatiana's voice rang out, smooth and professional, yet carrying that familiar undertone of malice disguised as concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but as safety is our top priority, I have a quick question for our esteemed passengers." A few heads turned, some passengers raising their brows in curiosity. Tatiana let the pause stretch just long enough before delivering the blow. "If there is a doctor on board, could you kindly make yourself known? We may have a passenger in need of medical attention." A hush fell over the cabin. Finn felt it immediately. The collective shift in the atmosphere, the way people straightened in their seats, eyes flicking toward him with varying degrees of concern, intrigue, and subtle disgust. A woman in pearls furrowed her brows, her gaze lingering on the red label still affixed above his seat. A businessman in a pressed navy suit leaned forward slightly, his expression caught between mild amusement and wariness. Tatiana, standing at the front of the cabin, clasped her hands together as if she had just performed a great act of service. Finn's grip tightened around the blanket. He could already hear the whispers starting, the unspoken questions. Is he sick? Should he even be flying? What if it's something contagious? From the row ahead, a man cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "Is something wrong?" he asked, glancing toward Tatiana. She sighed, shifting her weight ever so slightly, as if reluctant to share details, but oh so obligated to be transparent. "I certainly hope not," she said, voice laced with false reassurance. "But we always want to be prepared. Some passengers have unique health needs, and it's important that we ensure everyone's safety." She didn't name Finn directly, but she didn't have to. The damage had already been done. Finn exhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. He wouldn't give her the reaction she wanted. Not anger, not humiliation. He sat still as the weight of scrutiny settled onto him like a second skin, as passengers murmured amongst themselves, as he was turned into a liability rather than a person. A flight attendant near the back of the cabin hesitated, then raised a cautious hand. "I'm a registered nurse," she offered, her voice uncertain. "Is there?" Finn had had enough. He raised a hand slightly, just enough to cut through the tension. "I don't need medical attention," he said, voice steady. "I'm perfectly fine." Tatiana smiled at him, patronizing, indulgent. "Of course, Mr. Graves," she said lightly. "We just wanted to be sure. We wouldn't want anyone feeling uncomfortable, after all." The message beneath her words was clear. "You make people uncomfortable just by being here." The cabin slowly settled, but the unease lingered, clinging to the air like an invisible fog. Finn had thought that would be the end of it, that Tatiana had reached her peak, but he had underestimated just how much she wanted to push. 10 minutes later, as the meal service began, a flight attendant moved swiftly down the aisle with a tray of steaming entrees. The scent of rich sauces and fresh herbs filled the cabin as white-gloved hands placed dishes before each passenger. Grilled filet mignon, butter poached lobster, saffron-infused risotto. Finn, still seated in his dimly lit corner, watched as the attendant approached with his plate. Except this time, something was different. The tray in her hands wasn't a meal. It was a neatly folded apron, the fabric a dull navy blue, stark against the crisp white of the tablecloths surrounding him. The flight attendant, a young woman with a carefully neutral expression, hesitated before placing it in front of him. Then, as if just realizing what she had done, she gasped. "Oh," she said, hand flying to her mouth in exaggerated surprise. "I am so sorry. I thought you were part of the catering staff." Finn barely blinked. Across the cabin, someone snorted. Tatiana, standing just a few feet away, let out a soft laugh before quickly covering it with a cough. "Oh, dear," she murmured, shaking her head. "What a silly mistake. But I must say," she tapped a manicured finger against her chin, eyes raking over him in mock consideration, "you do have the look of someone who works hard in hospitality. You must get that all the time." The smirks, the whispers, the carefully suppressed laughter, it all hit at once, an orchestrated wave of humiliation that Tatiana conducted flawlessly. Finn didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply reached forward, picked up the apron, and held it for a moment, as if considering it. Tatiana watched him closely, waiting, expecting something. Finally, after a long pause, Finn folded the apron neatly, placed it beside his untouched tray, and turned his gaze to her with a kind of unreadable calm that made her smile falter for just a second. "Are you hiring?" he asked, his voice smooth, unshaken. "I have some experience handling difficult customers." Tatiana recovered quickly, her smile snapping back into place as if Finn's remark had never fazed her. But he had seen it, the momentary flicker of unease, the half-second where she hadn't anticipated his response. The balance of power hadn't shifted, but a crack had formed, a sliver of uncertainty that she would not allow to remain. She turned on her heel and walked away, signaling to a passing flight attendant with a subtle tilt of her head. The young man nodded and veered toward Finn's row, his movements precise and rehearsed. Finn watched as the attendant reached into the supply cart, pulled out a sanitary wipe, and, with exaggerated thoroughness, began scrubbing down every surface around Finn's seat. The armrests, the foldable tray, the edge of the overhead compartment, all of it wiped with mechanical precision, as if Finn had left some invisible contamination behind, some unseen presence that needed to be erased. The attendant worked in silence, his face carefully neutral, but the performance spoke louder than words. It wasn't about sanitation. It was about spectacle. The message was clear. Finn Graves did not belong here. A few rows ahead, a woman in an emerald green dress leaned toward her husband, her voice just loud enough to be overheard. "Are they usually this thorough?" she murmured. The man beside her chuckled, adjusting his cufflinks. "I suppose it depends on the passenger," he mused, his gaze flickering toward Finn before returning to his tablet. "Can't be too careful these days." A smirk ghosted across his lips. Finn inhaled slowly, staring straight ahead as the wiping continued, methodical and deliberate. The discomfort in the air was tangible not for him, but for the other passengers, the ones who felt validated in their suspicions, in the idea that he was something to be kept at a distance. He could feel the weight of their thoughts, their quiet assessments. What exactly is wrong with him? Is it contagious? Should he even be flying? Tatiana, lingering by the beverage cart, let out a small, satisfied hum as she refilled the passenger's glass, her attention only half invested in the task. Finn could see the way she angled her body, allowing herself the perfect vantage point to watch the scene unfold. She wasn't waiting for him to lash out. She was waiting for him to shrink. The flight attendant finally finished, offering Finn a clipped nod before retreating. leaving behind the distinct, sterile scent of disinfectant. Finn flexed his fingers against the coarse fabric of the orange blanket, willing himself to remain still. His pulse was steady, his breathing controlled, but beneath the surface, he could feel the slow burn of something sharp curling in his chest. He had endured degradation before, but Tatiana was masterful in the way she layered it, ensuring that every new humiliation settled deeper than the last. He barely had time to let the moment pass before the next blow landed. A sharp burst of muffled laughter from the row behind him made Finn's jaw tighten. He didn't turn around, but he could feel it. The way someone's phone was angled just slightly too high, the way the faint sound of a camera shutter had been drowned out by the white noise of the cabin. Someone was recording him. A few seats ahead, a young man in a designer hoodie grinned as he scrolled through his phone, his thumb moving rapidly over the screen. The woman beside him leaned in, whispering something with a smirk, and the young man let out a quiet chuckle. "I swear, this has to be going viral already," he muttered, angling the screen toward his companion. "I mean, seriously, what even is this?" "It's like watching a social experiment in real time." Finn exhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. He could guess what they were saying, what they were posting. A sickly-looking man, isolated in a sea of wealth, the subject of quiet ridicule. The contrast alone was enough to make it entertaining. He imagined the captions, "When you try to sneak into first class but forget to change your clothes," or POV, "You just realize this isn't economy." The internet thrived on moments like these, where cruelty could be disguised as humor, where a person's dignity could be turned into content. Tatiana, catching wind of the hushed amusement, let out a light laugh of her own, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against a champagne flute. "Oh dear," she murmured to no one in particular, though her voice carried just enough for Finn to hear. "I do hope our special passenger isn't feeling overwhelmed." It's always difficult adjusting to a new environment. The implication was razor sharp. He wasn't just a spectacle, he was an intruder. Finn's grip on the blanket tightened, but his expression remained placid. He could hear the subtle chime of notifications from the young man's phone, the quiet thrill of someone profiting off his humiliation in real time. This wasn't just exclusion, it was entertainment. Tatiana poured herself a glass of sparkling water, swirling it absently as she observed him from the corner of her eye. She wanted him to break, to snap, to give them something more, to lash out so that they could all reassure themselves that he truly didn't belong. Finn closed his eyes for a brief second before reopening them, forcing his heartbeat to remain even. He had seen worse. He had endured worse. The weight of scrutiny was no longer a distant, creeping sensation. It was suffocating, pressing against his chest with the full force of Tatiana's carefully orchestrated humiliation. He had tolerated the passive-aggressive remarks, endured the pointed glances, and ignored the phones discreetly capturing his every reaction. But he knew Tatiana was not satisfied. She wanted a conclusion, a final act, something definitive that would cement his place as the pariah of this flight. Tatiana turned away from the beverage cart with an air of faux professionalism, her fingers drifting over the panel beside her seat. A quiet chime echoed through the cabin as she activated the intercom, her voice smoothing over the speakers like silk. "Apologies for the brief interruption," she announced, her tone warm, placating, yet dripping with the subtle condescension of someone who believed they were doing the right thing. "I would just like to remind our passengers that if anyone feels unwell, unsafe, or uncomfortable at any point during our flight, our crew is more than happy to accommodate them in any way we can." She didn't say his name, but the implication was clear. A slow ripple of awareness passed through the cabin, eyes flicking toward Finn once again. The woman in emerald green shifted in her seat, her pearl earrings catching the low cabin light as she exchanged a glance with her husband. A man too rose ahead, exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly as if this entire situation were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Finn's fingers curled ever so slightly against his knee, his patience stretched thin, but he refused to rise to the bait. Tatiana, sensing the lack of immediate reaction, smiled and continued, directing her next words directly at him. "Mr. "Graves," she said sweetly, "I just want to make sure you're feeling all right. If this environment is too overwhelming, we do have alternative seating options available." She let the pause hang, her eyes gleaming with false sympathy. "Or, if necessary, we can assist in making other travel arrangements for you. If you feel out of place, there's no shame in choosing an option that suits you better." A heavy silence followed her words, a silence meant to isolate him further. Tatiana had shifted her approach from mockery to something far crueler, offering him an escape under the guise of kindness. If he protested, he would be difficult. If he accepted, he would be giving her exactly what she wanted. Before Finn could respond, a voice cut through the quiet. Honestly, a man's voice drawled, "Maybe that's not such a bad idea." A few passengers chuckled. Finn's eyes flicked toward the source, a businessman in his 60s, sharply dressed, his Rolex glinting under the cabin light as he swirled his drink with lazy indifference. His gaze landed on Finn with the air of someone discussing a matter rather than a person. "I mean, no offense," he continued, offering a half-hearted shrug, "but it doesn't look like you're having the best time up here. Maybe there's a more suitable arrangement." Finn remained still, his pulse steady, his expression blank. Tatiana pressed a hand to her chest, as if touched by the man's words. "That's exactly my concern," she said, nodding along. "We want all our passengers to feel comfortable, and it would be such a shame if someone fell out of place." The businessman nodded sagely, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. He hummed, his voice light but cutting. Could be his last trip, after all. No harm in making it a memorable one. The laughter that followed was different from the previous rounds of amusement. It was sharper, crueler, laced with the kind of detached mockery that people indulged in when they believed they were above consequences. Tatiana let the moment linger before offering a small, knowing smile, her fingers tapping lightly against her arm as she looked down at Finn. "You see?" she murmured, her voice carrying just enough volume for nearby passengers to hear. "People just want what's best for you, Mr. Graves." Finn inhaled slowly, steadying the anger that curled in his stomach like a coiled wire threatening to snap. She was testing him, pushing him toward the edge, waiting for him to lash out, waiting for that single moment of weakness where she could confirm every unspoken assumption about him, that he was fragile, that he was pathetic, that he wasn't supposed to be here. The young man with the phone, still scrolling through his messages, let out a soft chuckle. "Man, this is better than in-flight entertainment," he muttered to his companion. Finn unclenched his fists, his face remaining unreadable, his breathing even. Tatiana tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing in quiet satisfaction. She thought she had won. She thought this was the moment where he would crack. But Finn had played this game before. He simply leaned back against his uncomfortable seat, draped the garish orange blanket over his lap, and met her gaze with something she hadn't anticipated: patience. Tatiana's smile faltered for half a second. She had given him the perfect opportunity to break, to run, to confirm his place as the outsider in this cabin of wealth and privilege. But instead, he had chosen to remain, to endure, to let the silence stretch into something heavy, something she could no longer control. Finn adjusted the blanket slightly, as if settling in for the long haul. "I appreciate the concern," he said finally, his voice smooth, measured. "But I think I'll stay right here." Finn held Tatiana's gaze for a long, steady moment, his patience an unshakable force against her thinly veiled satisfaction. The balance of power had not yet shifted, but the tension in the air was different now, a subtle shift in the current that neither of them could fully define. Tatiana's smirk was still in place, but there was something just beneath the surface, an edge of uncertainty, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. She could feel it too. The moment had not played out the way she had intended. Then, the cabin lights flickered. It was a small disturbance at first, barely noticeable, but then it happened again, a brief sputter that sent thin shadows dancing across the plush leather seats. The ambient hum of the aircraft remained steady, but something had changed, an imperceptible disruption, something just off-kilter enough to make even the most indifferent passengers glance up from their champagne flutes and tablets. Finn stayed perfectly still, his fingers tightening around the edges of the orange blanket, a slow exhale slipping from his lips as a feeling settled over him. A shift in the game. The speakers overhead crackled, a sharp burst of static cutting through the cabin like a jagged knife. Tatiana's head snapped toward the intercom panel, her brows pulling together in confusion. Then, without warning, the usual in-flight announcements were replaced by a different voice, calm, deliberate, and weighted with authority. "Good evening, passengers," the voice began, smooth and commanding, carrying an unmistakable air of control. "I do apologize for the interruption, but I believe it's important to remind everyone aboard this flight that a highly distinguished individual is among us tonight." The cabin, which had been buzzing with low conversation only seconds ago, fell into absolute silence. Tatiana's expression hardened instantly, the confidence in her eyes flickering for the first time since the flight began. "What the hell is this?" she murmured under her breath, barely audible over the static that briefly flared through the speakers before clearing. She spun toward the cockpit, her polished professionalism cracking at the edges. "That's not standard protocol. Who authorized this message?" But Finn saw it immediately. The way certain passengers stiffened in their seats, the sudden ripple of unease that passed through a very specific group of individuals scattered throughout the first-class cabin. A well-dressed man near the exit reached into his suit jacket, his fingers brushing against something beneath the fabric before stopping short. A woman with diamond earrings, who had been whispering with her husband earlier, pressed a palm against her knee, her posture rigid. Two men seated near the front exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, their bodies unnaturally still. Tatiana noticed the shift too, though she didn't understand it yet. Her frustration deepened, her fingers moving swiftly over the control panel near the beverage cart as she attempted to override the announcement. "Apologies, passengers," she interjected. Her voice clipped as she forced her usual charming tone into place. "It appears we're experiencing some technical difficulties with the system. Please remain seated, and we'll have this resolved shortly." The intercom crackled again, cutting off her voice mid-sentence. The mysterious speaker returned, unfazed. "To those of you already aware of this individual's presence, I would advise remaining calm and making no sudden decisions. You understand what's at stake here." Tatiana's breath hitched. Finn remained motionless, his expression unreadable, but beneath the surface, something within him shifted. He knew this moment was coming. He had waited for it. A sharp intake of breath came from the businessman 2 rows ahead, the same man who had casually suggested Finn find more suitable arrangement earlier. His face had lost a fraction of its color. He turned slowly, his gaze snapping toward Finn with something new behind his eyes. Not amusement, recognition. Another passenger, one of the men in dark suits near the front, reached for his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. He wasn't texting. He was sending a warning. Tatiana, still oblivious to the growing sense of dread infecting certain corners of the cabin, let out an irritated sigh and turned toward the nearest flight attendant. "Get the captain on the radio. Now." But Finn had already seen enough. The pieces were falling into place. He shifted in his seat slightly, the slow, deliberate movement drawing just enough attention to make the tension worse. Across the cabin, a man in tinted glasses reached for the call button, his lips pressing into a thin line. A second later, his other hand moved, subtle, calculated, as he adjusted his watch. It was a signal. Tatiana, still oblivious, pinched the bridge of her nose and exhaled sharply. "I don't know what kind of stupid prank this is," she muttered, "but I'm going to put an end to it." The moment she turned, she finally noticed the change. She saw the businessman gripping his glass too tightly. She saw the nervous twitch of a woman adjusting the scarf around her neck. She saw the way 3 different passengers, all unrelated, all seated in different sections, were watching Finn now, not with amusement, not with disdain, but with something dangerously close to apprehension. Tatiana's carefully constructed facade remained intact, but Finn saw it now, the growing crack in her confidence, the way her fingers twitched against the hem of her uniform, the barely perceptible hesitation in her movements as she scanned the cabin. She still didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel the shift, that undeniable change in atmosphere that had turned Finn from an object of ridicule into something far more unsettling. The passengers who had laughed earlier were no longer amused. The ones who had recorded him had suddenly abandoned their phones. The businessman who had suggested he find a more suitable arrangement now looked like a man who had just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Then, in the middle of the tension-thickened silence, a man stood. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, the kind of attire that wasn't just expensive but strategic, meant to blend seamlessly into any environment while still radiating power. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, his features composed. But his eyes were locked onto Finn with the kind of respect that few people in this world commanded. He took a measured step forward, past the rows of first-class passengers who now sat frozen in place. Then, without hesitation, he bowed his head. "Mr. Graves," the man said, his voice low but carrying across the cabin like a gunshot, "I sincerely apologize for this oversight. Had I been aware of your presence sooner, I would have intervened." Tatiana's lips parted slightly, confusion flashing across her face before morphing into something resembling disbelief. She blinked once, then twice, as if trying to rearrange reality to make sense of what she was seeing. Finn didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle over every single person in that cabin before he exhaled slowly and stood up. The action was simple, unremarkable even, but the effect was immediate. The businessman, gripping his whiskey glass, let out a slow breath through his nose, as if realizing he'd been holding it for too long. The woman in pearls pressed her lips together, her fingers curling slightly against the armrest. The two men in dark suits near the cockpit exchanged a glance, not one of curiosity, but recognition. Tatiana, still rooted in place, shook her head slightly, a small, incredulous laugh slipping past her lips. "What is this?" she muttered, forcing her voice into something close to amusement, but failing miserably. "Some kind of joke?" Finn finally turned toward her. His movements were measured, deliberate, as he reached up and rolled back the sleeve of his left arm. The fabric of his blazer, once dismissed as old and unremarkable, now carried a different weight entirely, as it revealed a single, unmistakable piece of metal against his wrist. A band of silver, sleek, unadorned, yet carrying an insignia etched into its surface. The businessman who had spoken earlier stood up so fast his drink nearly toppled. "No," he whispered under his breath, his face paling. "No, that's not possible." Finn finally spoke, his voice still hoarse, still carrying that quiet fragility that had been mocked for hours. Yet now it sounded different, not weak, but dangerous. "It's always fascinating," he mused, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, watching how people treat someone they believe to be beneath them. How quickly they make assumptions. How easily they dismiss what they don't understand. His eyes flicked toward Tatiana, and this time, when he smiled, there was no warmth in it. She took a step back. The weight of the moment pressed down on the cabin like an unrelenting force. The passengers who had once whispered about Finn's presence now sat in stunned, horrified silence, realizing too late that they had been laughing at a man who could destroy them with a single word. Tatiana's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her mind scrambling for control, for anything that could salvage the situation. This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice quieter now, lacking the confidence it once held. "You." She shook her head again, forcing a thin smile. "If you were that important, then why didn't you say anything?" Finn tilted his head slightly, considering the question as if it genuinely amused him. Then, with the same calm precision that had unraveled the power dynamics of this flight in an instant, he answered, "Because I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't." Tatiana's breath came faster now, shallow and unsteady, her mind racing through the past few hours in desperate search of an escape route. Every carefully calculated insult, every veiled humiliation, every moment of engineered cruelty that she had orchestrated with such meticulous precision now loomed over her like an unrelenting storm, ready to crash down and sweep her away. The businessman who had laughed earlier was now whispering urgently into his phone, his hand trembling slightly as he typed. The woman in pearls had gone pale, her fingers digging into the armrest as if grounding herself against an impending disaster. The man in the black suit, still standing before Finn, merely inclined his head slightly before turning to the other passengers with a quiet command. "Stand down." The words were simple, but their effect was immediate. The tension in the air shifted once more, not with fear, but respect. Tatiana finally took a step back, her throat tightening as she realized the full weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just a wealthy man. This wasn't just someone important. This was someone who commanded power that reached far beyond the walls of this aircraft. Someone whose influence extended into places she could barely fathom. Her stomach twisted as she pieced together the reactions, the stiffened backs, the nervous glances, the way even the most arrogant passengers had suddenly shut up. Finn Graves wasn't just an elite passenger. He was a name whispered in corridors of power, a presence that made even the most untouchable individuals wary. A voice crackled through the cabin speakers, strained and urgent. "This is the captain," the pilot announced, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something verging on panic. "Mr. Graves, I was not informed of your presence on board. Had I known," he hesitated, then corrected himself. "Please accept my sincerest apologies on behalf of the entire crew. We are at your disposal for whatever you require." The shift was absolute. Finn had said nothing, had done nothing, yet the entire cabin had bent around him like gravity itself had realigned. He could have demanded an emergency landing. He could have had Tatiana escorted off the flight in restraints. He could have destroyed her with a single command. Instead, he simply exhaled, his fingers brushing against the silver band on his wrist, and smiled, a small, almost amused smile, as if all of this had played out exactly as he had expected. Tatiana opened her mouth, grasping for control, for authority, for anything that could salvage the wreckage of her carefully curated reality. But before she could speak, the man in the black suit turned toward her. His gaze was sharp, clinical, completely devoid of the amusement he had once held when Finn was just a nameless passenger. "Who authorized this treatment of Mr. Graves?" he asked, his voice devoid of inflection, as if the answer was irrelevant because the consequences were already decided. Tatiana's pulse pounded against her ribs, her carefully maintained poise fracturing under the weight of everyone watching. She started, but the businessman near the front cut her off with a sharp exhale, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. "You really didn't know who he was?" he murmured, almost pitying. "Oh, sweetheart, you just signed your own death warrant." The cabin fell into a deep, suffocating silence. Tatiana's breath itched, her skin prickling with the unmistakable sensation of her entire career crumbling beneath her feet. Finn finally spoke, his voice low even, but carrying the weight of undeniable finality. "I don't need to do anything," he said calmly, his gaze locked onto Tatiana's now pale face. "Because by the time this flight lands, your entire life will be unrecognizable." He didn't say it with malice. He didn't need to. It was a fact. The reality settled into her bones before she could even process it fully. The phone calls being made, the quiet discussions, the way certain passengers had already begun to distance themselves from her. This wasn't just about losing her job. This was about becoming untouchable, blacklisted, erased from the circles she had worked so hard to climb into. One simple directive from Finn Graves would ensure that she was shut out of every exclusive airline, denied entry to every elite event, reduced to nothing. Her hands trembled as she took a half step back, her mind screaming at her to fix this, to apologize, to do something. But it was too late. Finn sat back down, adjusting the sleeves of his blazer as if nothing had happened. The finality of the moment settled over her like a lead weight. He wasn't going to call security. He wasn't going to demand punishment. He didn't need to. The world they lived in, the world where power didn't need to be loud, would do it for him. The plane continued its course through the dark sky, cutting through the clouds with the same unwavering certainty as the fate that now awaited Tatiana Rhodes. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more intense and unexpected twists. What was your favorite moment? Did you see the ending coming, or did it completely surprise you? Let me know in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from.